Mark Baldassare, born in 1950, graduated from SUNY Stony Brook in 1972 and then completed his master's degree in 1973 at UC Santa Barbara and a PhD in 1976 at Berkeley. He and I were both lecturers in the Berkeley Sociology Department in 1976, after which he moved to UCLA, then to Columbia University, and finally settled at UC Irvine in 1981. A decade later, he founded the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Irvine and has remained very active in consulting and professional work since then. He serves as the president of the Public Policy Institute of California, a Los Angeles think tank that he helped to create. This article, published in 1992 while he was teaching at Irvine, was published in the Annual Review of Sociology. Articles in this journal typically are invited by the editors and contributed by leading scholars in specific fields to give an authoritative overview of the state of knowledge on a particular topic. It is a good place to begin in order to see the general outline of research interests related to suburbs as a special feature of urban life. We have seen that Curtis White and Guest found social networks of people look different in different urban locations. Metropolitan areas have grown so large and complex that we can no longer simply think in terms of urban versus non-urban or rural social settings. Differences in employment opportunities, housing characteristics, population composition, social networks, and personal attitudes and behavior appear in different parts of large urban areas. Baldassare directs our attention in this article to one particular aspect of this emerging urban diversity: the suburbs. So first of all, we have to be clear about what we mean by this word. What is a suburb? How do you know when you're in one? His answer is that the suburb is different from central cities in several key ways. First, population density is lower. Instead of multi-story apartment buildings and condominium towers, suburbs typically feature detached single-family houses, often stretching for miles in every direction. With some unusual exceptions, the only way to move around in these low-density areas depends on private cars and large amounts of space devoted to streets and highways. The paved transportation surfaces in these areas can amount to a large fraction of the total land area. Second, the standard image of a suburb tends toward single-use development. That is, residential land use dominates suburbs, with very little industrial or commercial development present. The only areas in these bedroom communities not covered by streets or private houses typically holds facilities serving the residents, such as schools, fire stations, gas stations, and perhaps a few retail outlets. Retail development tends to concentrate on the major transportation arteries leading out of the suburb toward areas that concentrate on commercial or industrial land uses. Third, depending on variations in legal frameworks, suburbs often achieve political separation as independent units within the larger metropolitan area, with their own elected officials and sometimes even their own public services, such as police and fire protection or trash removal. In all these ways, suburbs are distinct from the central city that often forms the older core of a large metropolitan area. The fact that suburbs tend to be newer than the rest of a metro area hints at the most important fact underlying their existence. For the last century or so, the long prehistoric and historical trend toward greater and greater population concentration and density in urban places has suddenly reversed, and urban populations have begun to disperse again, spreading out over the countryside out the historical limits of cities and lower urban population density. Suburbs are not a return to pre-urban, non-urban social settings. If suburbs are not exactly urban in the traditional sense, they also certainly are not rural. The fourth and final feature that distinguishes suburbs, according to Baldassare, is that the people living in them continue to have mostly non-agricultural jobs. We'll see later, since suburbs generally separate residential areas from places of work, suburban residents all share a gigantic new social problem that they all face in common. When you're at home, you're not at work, and when you're at work, you're not at home. Commuting back and forth on a massive scale between residential and work areas in a city emerges as a problem for cities only with the development of suburbs. Reflecting on this newness, Baldassare looks back to times before suburbs emerged. We can do within the historical bounds of the United States, since the country started out as a pre-industrial society, with 90% of all its citizens living in rural areas and working in subsistence agriculture. A useful point that pre-industrial cities like colonial Boston or Philadelphia or Savannah have suburbs. There was just the city itself and perhaps a few outlying towns that functioned as separate communities of their own. If we look closer at the earliest years of U.S. history, however, we can find some early signs even then of the idea of suburbs. For example, Stephanie Grauman-Wolfe published her book, Urban Village, to call our attention to an interesting little place called Germantown, a small town near the outskirts of colonial Philadelphia. She documents how even during the period that Philadelphia was technically a pre-industrial city in a pre-industrial society, Germantown began to evolve from a separate little town with its own local economy and round of life into a very early example of a bedroom community for some of the more prosperous and successful people from the larger nearby city. In most colonial American cities along the Atlantic coast, their pre-industrial character meant that there was little in the way of plumbing or sanitation, and as these places grew larger and larger, the public health consequences of unorganized access to water and uncontrolled disposal of sewage grew more and more serious, resulting in regular, repeated epidemics of contagious diseases like cholera and yellow fever during the hot, humid summer months. People who could afford to do so got out of town to places like Germantown. This is the origin of the idea of the summer house, but these early influences of cities reshaping the small towns around them was only a hint of things to come. Baldassare traces several stages in the emergence of full-fledged suburbs. After the pre-industrial phase, when not much was happening, the early period of industrialization led not only to the rapid growth of urban populations, but to the beginnings of the deconcentration out into the suburbs. Scholars have shown this growth was caused in the case of American cities both by massive immigration and by faster natural increase due to declines in death rates. First phase of suburban expansion, as cities were just developing beyond the stage of the pre-industrial walking city, transport limitations shaped the way these earliest suburbs could form. Since cars were not around yet at that point, the only way to move large numbers of people in and out of the old central city was by streetcar, at first pulled by horses and eventually driven by electricity. The private companies that organized streetcar transportation made huge financial fortunes and often were involved in amazing amounts of political graft and corruption to ensure their continued profits. The suburbs that formed around these streetcar lines, radiating out from the city like the spokes of a wheel, were even called streetcar suburbs by many people, including Sam Bass Warner, who wrote a well-known book about them with that name. We can see a good example of this radial growth of the streetcar suburbs in the case of Chicago, starting from its tiny presence on the western shore of Lake Michigan immediately after the Civil War. Since it lies at a break in transportation between the water routes of the Great Lakes and the land routes, especially the railroads that reach into the heart of North America, this location was destined to become a major urban area. We can see the expansion of the urban boundaries decade by decade. By 1870, we already find the first transportation routes leading out of the city, one to the north and one to the southwest. These earliest routes were not railroads, however, but canals. The mid-1800s were the heyday of water transportation by canal in the United States, and even today some of these huge canal construction projects are being revitalized as historical sites and tourist attractions. The legal limits of the city also began to creep outward. As the population grows over the next 20 years, the city begins to spread out along several axes, one to the south and others to the southwest, the west, the northwest, and the north. Shortly afterward, the rail lines for streetcars began to extend these urban tentacles that snaked out into the surrounding countryside, and their presence accelerated the deconcentration of the city as more people followed the streetcars out to live in the emerging suburbs. By 1900, we can see this radial development already in full bloom. This deconcentration reduced the overall density of the growing metropolitan region, even though the skyscrapers in the Chicago city center continued to reach higher and higher, and population density at the core continued to increase. By 1920, at the dawn of the automobile age, the streetcar suburbs of Chicago are plain to see. One of the most important features of this suburban deconcentration of the urban population has continued to the present day. The shift to the suburbs did not draw randomly from the city's population. As Baldassare reminds us, the new, larger homes appearing in the suburbs, each on its own separate parcel of open land, were beyond the means of many city residents. Only the more prosperous upper and middle classes could aspire to move to the suburbs, so their development created massive new sorting and segregation of cities along lines of social class. Developers and the earliest suburban residents also cooperated to make sure that these places also were segregated by ethnicity, with certain groups excluded from certain areas. The emergence of suburbs during the early industrial period is sometimes described as a push driven by the desire of people to get away from each other and from the crowded, noisy, and often unclean and unhealthy central city. This is only half the picture, however, because suburbanization of American cities in particular has also been driven by a pull factor of tremendous fortunes to be made by people who sell the land for new suburbs and who build the new houses, the streets, the water and sewer lines, and all the rest of the suburban infrastructure. The incentives for people to supply new suburban neighborhoods were every bit as strong as the incentives for city residents to demand a place to live in them. The last 100 years or so, the second great transformation of suburbs has taken place in our cities. Baldassare points to the automobile as one of the main motors, if you'll excuse the pun, in this second wave of change. Once people could move rapidly all around the entire urban area as individuals, all bets about streetcar suburbs were off. If we think of the first phase of suburbanization as extension of the octopus-like tentacles of streetcar lines out into the countryside, we can visualize the streetcar suburbs of Chicago reaching out like the radial spokes of a wheel. Land along these lines suddenly became valuable, making fortunes for the developers who built the streetcar suburbs, as well as for the usually corrupt streetcar companies themselves. It meant that people could stray off these radial spokes. The automobile age of suburbs resulted in the cheaper land between these spokes of the wheel opening up for development, and even newer and brighter suburban areas building in between the older spokes of the streetcar lines. The streetcar suburbs often reached out into destinations that had been even older outlying towns, so when the areas between the spokes eventually filled in, ironically the streetcar suburbs and the outlying towns at their destinations gradually became the old suburbs, with smaller, older, less valuable houses, smaller lots, more traffic, and many of the other factors that people had moved out of the city to escape. The new automobile suburbs, in between the streetcar line spokes of the wheel, became the desirable, new, higher status destinations. We should not think that the central cities just shriveled up and disappeared with this suburban expansion, though. The early 20th century and the beginning of the automobile age coincided with another very important change in American society. As the stream of immigrants coming into the country gradually shifted at the turn of the century, Americans discovered that instead of new arrivals from the traditional sources of England, Scotland, Germany, Scandinavia, and the rest of northwestern Europe, the complexion of the immigrant stream was shifting. New faces from Poland, Greece, and even China and Latin America were beginning to appear on the streets of U.S. cities. In reaction, the United States passed drastic, restrictive laws against immigration in the 1920s, just as the great industrial cities were getting some serious momentum going. Leaders of this industrial boom, like Albert Gary of U.S. Steel, who had a city in Indiana named after him, looked around desperately for a new source of cheap labor to work in their factories when they suddenly found the pipeline of foreign immigrants shut off. They hit upon the idea of sending recruiters to blanket the American South, still mostly lying in rural stagnation ever since the end of the Civil War. These recruiters found a vast, willing new population of potential workers for the northern factories, and the Great Migration of the early 20th century quickly swelled to a flood of new migrants. A lot has been written about the massive shift of the nation's black population in particular from the rural South to the urban North, and this was indeed a dramatic demographic shift. Half the black population of South Carolina disappeared in a few decades, for example, moving to northern cities along the Atlantic coast. And the exodus from the east-south central states of Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky was even more pronounced. But we should not forget that the Great Migration also included a substantial number of rural white workers, who also made their way to cities like Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, and the other booming industrial cities. The Great Migration ensured that even without the previous stream of immigrants, there would be plenty of people arriving in the central cities of these booming industrial areas, occupying the city housing left behind by the people flowing out to the new suburbs. The private entrepreneurs and public officials riding this urban industrial wave were not going to leave anything to chance, however. By the middle of the 20th century, two major new government initiatives were cemented into place by concerted efforts of these groups of leaders, guaranteeing that the growth of suburbs would accelerate even more. We sometimes hear that the United States has an official urban policy about what our cities should be like, leaving that up to the free market to decide. But these two massive programs are in fact deliberate urban policies that stack the deck in favor of suburbs and continued urban deconcentration. The first of these policies was a federal subsidy for the interstate highway system. While interstate highways run through a lot of rural countryside, their biggest impact has been on the shape of our cities. If you want to build a freeway through the center of a city, or maybe 2 or 3 intersecting freeways, or if you want to build a ring freeway around the outskirts of the city, or if you want to build feeder freeways that lead in and out of a city, like the former streetcar lines, and often paved over the top of those streetcar lines, you can get 90% of the money you need for the project from the federal government. Only 10% has to come from the local city government, from private developers, and other sources. This massive subsidy of freeways encouraged road building by private contractors, and the result was a new network of efficient transportation routes to allow people to zoom in and out of cities from their jobs to their suburban homes. At about this same time, the financial rules in the United States were changed concerning how we buy our homes. Historically, anyone who wanted to borrow money from banks needed to put down up to half the entire purchase price of a house as a cash deposit to convince the bank that you wouldn't walk away from the loan. This meant that over 2/3 of the entire population of the U.S. rented their homes since they couldn't afford to buy them. In the 20th century, the federal government started a new program to insure such loans. People would pay a mortgage insurance premium as part of their mortgage loan payments. The money went to the federal government, who used it to pay off banks for any bad mortgages that failed. With this kind of support, the banks agreed to offer long-term mortgages at very low interest rates and very little money for down payments, since they could always go to the federal government in a pinch. The federally insured cheap mortgage allowed tens of millions of new homeowners to buy new homes in the suburbs, further fueling their growth. Today, about 2/3 of Americans are homeowners instead of 2/3 being renters. Urbanization has resulted in an unprecedented deconcentration of formerly dense city populations, and along with this dispersion of people has come segregation by both social class and ethnicity on a scale not seen in the densely packed cities of the pre-suburban era. It is easy to see why this transformation has amounted to the American dream coming true for many suburban residents. They got private homes, green lawns, neighbors a lot like themselves, low mortgage payments, and at least at first, easy commutes in and out of the urban centers where they continued to have good careers. But as the Great Migration tapered off and the central cities continued to hollow out, the flight to the suburbs increasingly left behind an isolated, segregated, economically disadvantaged remnant of people living in the central cities. The sorting out of urban areas along lines of social class and ethnicity concentrated all of the advantages of life in the suburbs. But the other side of that coin concentrated more and more social problems in the old central city. The result should not have been as surprising as it was. Early in the second half of the 20th century, many of America's central cities literally caught fire. In the hot summers of the 1960s and early 1970s, Detroit was burning, Philadelphia was burning, the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles was burning. Crowds rioted in the streets, looted stores, burned down entire blocks and neighborhoods of the city. Their sense of dead-end despair and hopelessness meant they felt they had nothing to lose. People were killed in battles with police. Social scientists, who had been content up to that point simply to draw diagrams of concentric rings and talk about urban growth and change as a kind of natural process, like astronomers viewing the stars and planets, found that these descriptions were not very helpful for understanding the sudden explosions of violence and despair coming out of the central cities. A whole new orientation began to take shape as a counterpoint to the urban ecologists and their models of cities as physical places. The new field of urban political economy emerged to describe the social and economic processes that create and transform these places. It calls the fourth and last stage of suburban evolution the metropolitan era, recognizing that as cities spread out, they no longer fit the concept of a single densely settled place, but sorted themselves into very complex, highly differentiated urban regions. He points out that in this metropolitan era, a large majority of the entire population of the United States has moved to suburban neighborhoods. This means that in most major metropolitan centers today, the weight of numbers for elections and other political decisions has shifted and is now centered in the suburbs. If officials are elected citywide, the suburban vote will determine the winner of every race. If you create single-member districts so that central city residents can elect someone to represent them, the suburban representatives will outnumber central city representatives on boards and city councils and still control the political process. Decade by decade, the power of the suburbs to call the shots in urban politics has been increasing. Since migration to the suburbs has been selective on the whole for people with more money, higher education, and better jobs, metro region economies increasingly resemble donuts, a ring of rich, good taste around the outside and a hole in the center. As we will see in future readings, one of the serious problems affecting urban areas today is that not only have the majority of people moved to suburbs, and not only has the migration been selective of all kinds of positive social and economic characteristics, but after a short lag, the employers and the good jobs began to follow them out to the suburbs, so that they don't even have to commute back into the central city for work. This portrait of general affluence and prosperity in the suburbs can be exaggerated, though. While the average education, income, and so on of people moving to suburbs and living in suburbs exceeds the overall average for most metro areas, like all averages, this can be misleading. We already have seen one clue about this based on the different eras for development for the first streetcar suburbs and the later automobile suburbs. Wherever you find this historical plan, you usually find that the older, smaller houses in the streetcar suburbs end up in the hands of less educated, less affluent people who work in lower-paid service, clerical, or blue-collar jobs, while the newer, more prestigious automobile suburbs attract the managers and professionals who can afford the more expensive, larger houses and better neighborhoods. Not all suburbs, that is, are created equal. The political fragmentation of suburban regions actually encourages this diversity, allowing elite enclaves of privilege, with lots so large you can barely see any neighbors, sites for mansions worthy of an earlier Gilded Age. A few miles away we may find a suburb of modest houses filled with factory workers, or a self-contained suburban ethnic neighborhood. Kenneth Jackson talked about this sorting out and diversity in his book about suburban realities, Crabgrass Frontier. He also suggested that as people rushed out of the city to escape the problems of urban life, they ended up bringing most of those problems with them to their new suburban locations. To understand this compartmentalization of the suburbs, this sorting out by class, by ethnicity, even by age groups in some cases, A key point to remember concerns the laws that allow bits and pieces of this suburban world to break off politically from larger metropolitan areas and form their own local governments. Without this legal and political fact of life, it would be much harder for these local communities to play the game of capturing positive externalities, a term used by economists to describe scenic views, green spaces, good schools, nice houses, and perhaps most important, powerful and affluent neighbors. It would be much harder for them to avoid negative externalities like noisy traffic, nuisance land uses like factories, garbage dumps, airports, freeways, railroad switching yards, or warehouse districts. Political fragmentation of the suburbs from the rest of the city, including other suburbs, always turns out to be good for some people and bad for others. It helps to erase what Max Weber regarded as one of the most valuable features of truly urban life: the necessity of encountering and dealing with all kinds of people different from yourself in many ways as the price you must pay to live in a complex, thriving city environment. In the suburbs, we find many ways to escape from others who are different from ourselves along almost any dimension you care to imagine. Baldassare goes on to describe other interesting features of suburban life in the contemporary metropolitan era. One of these is what he calls the growth revolt, the movement by people in many suburban communities to lock in their pleasant way of life and prevent more intensive development, such as increasing density with neighborhoods of townhomes, or more extensive development, such as new suburbs that leapfrog outward past existing ones and turn them into second-class destinations by comparison with the newer arrivals. Since his article focuses entirely on the urban scene in the United States, Baldassare discusses these growth control movements mainly in terms of political campaigns to pass new laws against more growth or to control zoning ordinances to prevent conversion of land from one use to another. These political efforts are all we can rely on in the United States because we have basically refused to give cities the power to participate in their own economic futures. By comparison, it is interesting to consider many European countries where cities themselves can actually participate in the real estate market, buying up land in outlying areas and controlling what happens to it. If they allow new subdivisions to be built, they may tax the new developments heavily to capture some of the unearned profits that otherwise would go into the pockets of land speculators and private developers. If they don't allow new subdivisions, they keep open space and natural environments close to the existing neighborhoods. In the American suburbs today, though, Baldassare concludes that when it comes to urban society, you can run, but you can't hide. He expresses much the same view as Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier, judging that as the suburbs become mature social environments, they develop a number of social problems and challenges that sometimes simply repeat problems of people in the central cities, and sometimes also create new, distinctly suburban issues, such as inefficient, inconvenient transportation and access to basic services and amenities. Perhaps nothing horrifies a true suburbanite quite so much as the prospect of getting older and losing the ability to drive a car. This can make a person an almost total prisoner inside an otherwise delightful suburban home. As the scale of suburban life continues to expand, it also can be difficult to sustain a real sense of community, and we may well see the whole discussion of urban anomie reinterpreted, this time as suburban anomie. The final challenge that Baldassare reviews for contemporary suburbs relates to the sorting out and separation of people based on social class and ethnicity, with the suburbs tending to concentrate wealth and advantage. People who can't afford the suburban homes or the cars to drive back and forth to them get excluded. He frames this issue as a question of access to affordable housing, since local political control of zoning rules allows communities to keep less expensive, more intensive forms of land use like apartments and townhouses out. This is a good example of one end result of deconcentration and compartmentalization of the urban environment.